Halloween night in Edgewood Estates should have felt safe. The street was alight with jack-o'-lanterns, their grins flickering in the cool October breeze. Children darted between houses, their costumes rippling under porch lights, while parents laughed, sipping from steaming mugs. It was the epitome of suburban tranquility, every home dressed in fake cobwebs and paper skeletons. But beneath that facade of normalcy, something rotted. And the team sent to investigate knew it all too well. "Eyes up," murmured Captain Harris through the comms. His voice was a sharp whisper against the buzzing atmosphere of Halloween merriment. "This isn't what it looks like." The four-man Spec Ops unit moved through the shadows, silent and invisible. Harris led them, his gloved hand clenched around the grip of his rifle. Behind him, Lewis checked the corners, sweeping the neighborhood with a trained gaze. Mendoza brought up the rear, nervously adjusting the straps on his vest. They were hardened soldiers, used to combat in some of the darkest parts of the world. But this wasn't a war zone. Not yet. Their target? House 57, a pristine two-story home near the end of the block. The bioterrorist they were hunting, Dr. Marcus Langdon, was rumored to be inside. But something else lurked in the depths of Edgewood Estates. Something far more twisted. A flicker of movement caught Harris's eye. A child in a skeleton costume skipping up a driveway, plastic buckets swinging. His mother stood at the edge of the yard, waving. Innocence. If only they knew, Harris thought grimly. "Approaching the house," Mendoza whispered, voice tense. They could hear the faint hum of laughter, the rustling of autumn leaves, but nothing else. Too quiet. The house loomed ahead, porch dark, the windows black holes in the face of the neighborhood. Harris signaled for the others to fan out, and they moved with precision. No words, only gestures, only instinct. And then they heard it. At first it sounded like a low groan, a hollow gurgling noise that barely pierced the air. Harris paused, lifting his fist to signal a halt. The team crouched behind the hedges bordering the house, eyes scanning the surrounding area. Groan. Gurgle. It was getting louder, wet. Like something thick was bubbling up from the depths of the earth. The sound crawled under their skin, twisting into a sickening unease. "Mendoza, check the perimeter," Harris ordered, his voice steady despite the building dread. Mendoza nodded and peeled off to circle the house. The others moved to the door. Harris tested the knob, unlocked. Inside, the air was damp and heavy. The house stank of rot, like meat left to fester in the sun, bloated and writhing with flies. Harris's flashlight sliced through the darkness, revealing a once beautiful interior now decayed and abandoned. Furniture overturned, stains, dark and greasy, spattered the walls. The groaning sound was louder now, but they couldn't pinpoint its source. "What the hell happened here?" Lewis muttered, barely audible. Then, a sudden clatter from the kitchen. Dishes hitting the floor. The team whipped around, rifles aimed. Harris gestured, and Lewis crept forward, his finger hovering near the trigger. The kitchen was a ruin. Mold crept up the walls, and the floor was sticky with some kind of viscous substance. But the worst part was the table. Sprawled across it was what had once been a man. Now, his skin had split like overripe fruit. His costume, a cheap pirate outfit, was soaked with dark, syrupy blood, and his mouth was a gaping, yawning hole. His eyes bulged out of his skull, his teeth exposed in a grotesque, eternal scream. "Jesus Christ," Lewis whispered, bile rising in his throat. But the body wasn't done. The man's torso heaved, his ribs cracking as something moved inside him. The skin along his abdomen stretched grotesquely, and a sickening wet sound, like fabric being torn apart, filled the room. From his belly, a small hand pushed outward, its fingers curling, its nails jagged and blackened. Harris stepped back, horror twisting through him. "We need to..." Crack! The thing inside the corpse tore free in a burst of gore, sending a spray of blood and entrails across the kitchen floor. It was small at first, the size of a child, but its skin was slick and black, its eyes hollow pits of shadow. Its mouth, filled with jagged teeth, stretched far too wide for its head, and it crawled out of the man like some grotesque parody of birth. And then it screamed, a high, piercing wail that made their ears ring. "Open fire!" Harris shouted. But the thing was fast, inhumanly fast. It darted across the kitchen floor, skittering like an insect, leaving bloody handprints in its wake. Mendoza burst through the back door, panting, face pale. "Captain, we got... What the fuck is that?" Lewis fired, bullets ripping into the creature's back, but it didn't stop. Its body seemed to absorb the rounds, flesh rippling with each impact. It turned toward them, grinning with a mouth full of teeth like broken glass, and lunged. It tore into Lewis's neck with brutal efficiency, teeth sinking deep into his flesh. His scream gurgled into a wet choke as blood sprayed out, his carotid artery severed in a messy torrent. The thing gnawed and ripped, tearing away skin and muscle, blood painting the walls. Harris unloaded into the creature's head, the bullets finally connecting with something vital. Its skull burst like a rotten melon, splattering the kitchen in black, oily blood. The thing dropped, lifeless. But it wasn't over. They heard it again. Another groan, deeper this time, and it was coming from the street. "We need to move," Harris ordered, voice tight. "We're not alone." The team stepped outside, and what they saw sent a chill down their spines. Across the neighborhood, the costumed children had changed. A group of kids in zombie makeup stumbled down the street, but their movements were wrong. Jerky. Too realistic. One of them, a boy no older than 8, peeled his own face off, revealing raw muscle beneath. He cackled, tossing the shredded skin aside as if it were part of the game. A girl dressed as a princess stared at them with black, soulless eyes, her hands slick with blood. She was holding a severed head by the hair. Her mother's. And she grinned, teeth sharp as knives. Everywhere they looked, the neighborhood had become a nightmare. The virus had spread. And the monsters weren't pretending anymore. The street had turned into a war zone, but not one any of them were trained for. Captain Harris clenched his rifle tighter, pulse hammering in his ears. The night was thick with screams, some human, most not. Figures darted through the shadows, their forms grotesque and twisted, shifting between the familiar and the monstrous. What had once been children in costumes were now flesh-hungry abominations. The thought of it turned his stomach. "We need to pull back. Regroup at the rally point," Harris barked, trying to keep his voice steady, but the dread was creeping in. The streetlights flickered ominously, casting the neighborhood in brief bursts of light that only made things worse. The jack-o'-lanterns lining the sidewalk seemed to leer at them, their carved smiles taunting. Mendoza was still shaking, trying to wipe the blood from his face. Lewis's body lay slumped against the wall of the house, his throat a mess of torn flesh and arterial spray. They didn't have time to mourn. "Mendoza, get it together," Harris snapped. "We're moving out." I saw them, Captain. Kids, families. Just changing. Right in front of me," Mendoza stammered, his eyes wide and unblinking. His voice trembled as he pointed toward the row of houses where families had been trick-or-treating moments ago. They're coming for us. Stay focused. We can't save them. Not now." Harris motioned for the team to advance, but the sound of footsteps, a mass of them, approached from the far end of the block. Shapes moved through the darkness, hunched figures emerging under the streetlights. The once cheerful skeleton costumes were now real horrors, bones exposed, some jutting out unnaturally, their flesh hanging in torn ribbons. One child, his face a shattered skull, dragged a bloody trick-or-treat bag that sloshed with the sound of fluids, something heavy scraping along inside. "Contact, 12 o'clock, Harris said, his voice low but tense. "We're not dealing with people anymore. Weapons free." The team raised their rifles just as the horde broke into a sprint. What had been children were now feral, limbs thrashing as they charged, eyes glowing, teeth bared. The worst part wasn't their speed. It was the laughter, those high-pitched giggles of children playing, warped and twisted into something sickening as they ran toward death. "Open fire!" The first rounds hit the front line of monsters, splattering them across the pavement. Heads exploded, limbs flew, but the horde didn't stop. A zombie boy with a baseball bat, face half sloughed off, leapt onto Mendoza before anyone could react. Mendoza screamed as the thing sank its teeth into his shoulder, chewing through muscle. Harris turned, unloading his rifle into the creature's chest until it collapsed in a heap of bone and blood. But Mendoza was already done for. The infection spread fast. Harris knew it, and so did Mendoza. "I can feel it." Mendoza's voice was barely a whisper as his skin began to warp. His fingers twitched, his veins pulsing with sickly black fluid. He fell to his knees, clutching his stomach as it rippled beneath his hands, bones cracking as his spine bent backward. "Mendoza!" Harris called, but there was nothing he could do. Mendoza's eyes rolled back, his skin stretched taut across his skull, and his mouth split open in a grotesque grin as his teeth grew into jagged fangs. With one final guttural scream, he lunged forward, no longer human. Harris didn't hesitate. The bullet tore through Mendoza's head, splattering the sidewalk with blood and brain matter. Harris stood over the corpse, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The infection was spreading too fast. They were losing control. "Fuck," Harris growled, turning toward the last remaining team member, Ramirez, who stood wide-eyed, his rifle trembling in his hands. "We're falling back. Now." Ramirez nodded, face pale beneath the grime and sweat. He looked young, too young to be witnessing this nightmare, but there wasn't time to console him. The creatures were everywhere now, spilling out of houses, crawling from backyards, and pouring into the street like a flood of nightmares. They moved through the neighborhood, trying to stay in the shadows, but it was impossible to go unnoticed. Every turn revealed something worse. A girl in a tattered princess costume walked by, her doll clutched to her chest. Only, the doll had no head, and her dress was soaked with blood. She turned toward them, eyes empty, and opened her mouth to scream, but it wasn't a scream. It was the sound of metal scraping bone, a hideous, unholy shriek that echoed through the streets. Ramirez fired instinctively, the bullet tearing through her chest, sending her flying backward. But more came. Clowns, vampires, witches, all transformed into twisted, grotesque versions of their costumes, their bodies gnarled and bloody. "Cap, they're coming from everywhere," Ramirez gasped, reloading as fast as he could. "We're screwed." "No! We keep moving. Get to the safe house," Harris ordered, pushing Ramirez forward. "The bioweapon is still out there. This is only going to get worse." As they pressed deeper into the neighborhood, the streets began to narrow, the rows of houses closing in. Shadows danced under flickering lights, the air thick with the stench of decay and death. The groaning, gurgling sound that had haunted them earlier now surrounded them, coming from every direction. It was as if the entire town was coming alive, twisting into something monstrous. Suddenly, a group of trick-or-treaters blocked their path. Harris raised his rifle, but something about these figures made him hesitate. They were motionless, standing perfectly still in the middle of the street. Their costumes, a scarecrow, a mummy, and a devil, were pristine, untouched by the chaos. "Sir, what the hell?" Before Ramirez could finish, the scarecrow moved. Its head jerked to the side with a sickening crack, straw pouring from its mouth, and then it ran toward them, unnaturally fast. The other two followed, their bodies contorting, limbs breaking and resetting with each step. Harris opened fire, but the bullets barely slowed them. The scarecrow reached Ramirez first, slamming him to the ground with enough force to shatter bone. Harris fired into its back, tearing it apart, but it didn't stop. Its hands, no, claws, dug into Ramirez's chest, ripping flesh and bone apart like wet paper. Blood spurted in thick streams as Ramirez screamed, his ribs snapping one by one. Harris emptied the rest of his clip into the creature, finally dislodging it from Ramirez's lifeless body. But Ramirez was already gone, his organs strewn across the pavement, a bloody mess of shredded muscle and tissue. Harris stood alone now, his breath ragged, his mind racing. The infection wasn't just spreading, it was mutating, twisting these people into something beyond human, beyond monster. This wasn't a simple containment mission anymore. This was a massacre. In the distance, Harris saw the rally point, the supposed safe house where they were supposed to regroup. But now, as more of the infected began pouring out from the darkness, grotesque and hungry, he wasn't sure there was anywhere safe left in Edgewood Estates. The infection had taken root, and the real nightmare was just beginning. The safe house stood at the end of the street, a beacon of false hope against the nightmare unraveling before Captain Harris. The blood from Ramirez's mangled corpse still clung to his boots, sticky and thick. His pulse thundered in his ears, and for the first time in his career, Harris felt the icy grip of panic tighten around his chest. The monsters, no, the people that once were, surged through the suburban streets, each twisted form more grotesque than the last. The infection had transformed them into parodies of their costumes, hulking, slavering creatures, their skin cracking like overcooked meat, bones protruding in unnatural angles, dripping with blood and viscera, and they were everywhere. From where he stood, Harris could see the creatures tearing through families, some still in their costumes, others caught mid-transformation, their bodies splitting open as flesh and costume fused grotesquely. A mother dressed as a witch cradled her child, before her face split into a hideous grin, her teeth growing into jagged fangs. She ripped the child's throat out with a single, savage bite. Harris turned away, bile rising in his throat. There was no time to dwell on it. His team was gone, the mission in shambles. Now it was just him, the streets, and the monsters. The flickering streetlights barely illuminated the carnage, casting the advancing horde in an eerie glow. Figures loped from the shadows, snarling and giggling as they came closer. Their laughter was like glass scraping metal, wrong and broken. A young girl, dressed as a ballerina, twirled in front of him, her blood-soaked tutu spinning as her skin peeled from her legs with every rotation. Her eyes, black, soulless pits, locked onto Harris, and her mouth opened in a high-pitched, unnatural scream. Harris shot her without hesitation, the bullet tearing through her forehead. She crumpled like a broken doll, collapsing into a heap on the pavement. But more were coming. The street had become a slaughterhouse. The once cheerful Halloween decorations now hung limp, stained with blood. Skeletons danced on porches, not out of festive fun, but because the people behind them were no longer human, only hollowed-out husks, limbs flailing in violent spasms as they tore each other apart. Harris ran. His boots pounded against the pavement, echoing through the carnage. But the monsters followed. The sound of tearing flesh, gnashing teeth, and that hideous laughter filled the air. Every house, every yard was a scene of horror. One house had been decorated with fake cobwebs and giant plastic spiders, but now, Harris saw the real thing. Webs coated in blood and gore, bodies twitching inside, wrapped in silk spun by something much larger, much hungrier. As he sprinted down the street, he heard the groaning sound again, louder now, closer. It seemed to come from beneath the ground, like the earth itself was sick, infected with whatever this virus was. The sound reverberated up through the pavement, making Harris's skin crawl. He had to keep moving. Ahead, a group of figures stumbled into view, but something about them was different. They weren't just regular trick-or-treaters twisted into monstrosities. They were deliberate, controlled. Harris slowed his pace as he neared the group. 3 costumed figures stood motionless in the street, facing him. One was dressed as a plague doctor, its long, bird-like mask illuminated by the nearby streetlight. The mask was fused with the figure's face, the skin beneath cracked and mottled. Tubes ran through its flesh, pumping black liquid that oozed out in thick rivulets, staining the ground beneath its feet. The figure lifted its hand, and Harris froze. It was Langdon. Harris raised his rifle, aiming squarely at the figure's head. "Langdon! Drop whatever the hell this is, or I swear!" The plague doctor's head cocked to the side with a slow, deliberate motion, almost curious. Its hollow masked eyes gazed at Harris, unmoved by the threat. "I warned them, Captain," a voice rasped from behind the mask, wet and guttural, like someone speaking through thick sludge. "I warned them all, and they didn't listen." Harris's finger tightened on the trigger. "What the hell did you do?" Langdon chuckled, the sound distorted, inhuman. "They wanted soldiers. They wanted power. I gave them exactly that. But they forgot what power does. It corrupts. It transforms." Harris fired, the bullet tearing through the plague doctor's chest, but it barely staggered Langdon. The black fluid spilled from the wound, hissing as it hit the ground, but the figure didn't fall. It laughed, louder now, a cacophony of grotesque amusement that echoed off the houses around them. "They're mine now," Langdon crooned. "This town, this night, it belongs to them. To me." The other figures beside Langdon shifted. One dressed as a devil, its horns protruding from its skull, skin cracked and leaking fire, and the other, a skeleton, its bones jagged and sharp, like blades. They stepped forward in unison, advancing on Harris. He emptied his clip, rounds tearing through their bodies, but it was futile. The creatures barely flinched, their forms healing almost instantly as black liquid pooled around their feet. Harris backed away, his heart hammering in his chest. He needed a plan. Something. Anything. But there was no escape. Langdon's twisted army was closing in, and the street behind him was filled with the infected. The children, the parents, the innocent who had been twisted into monsters by the virus. The once peaceful neighborhood was now a breeding ground for nightmares, and Harris was in the center of it all. Langdon's voice slithered through the air, thick with malice. "You'll join them soon, Captain. Everyone will." Harris gritted his teeth, backing up until his heel hit the sidewalk. He glanced toward the safe house. It was so close, just down the block. But between him and safety was a horde of twisted creatures. And at their center, Langdon, grinning behind that grotesque plague mask. The earth groaned beneath his feet, the ground cracking as something began to rise. Langdon's hand lifted toward the ground, and a dark shadow rippled out from beneath him, spreading across the pavement like a living thing. Harris felt the ground shift beneath him, and then, with a violent tremor, the street erupted. From the cracks in the pavement, more of the infected poured forth, half-buried, mutilated bodies that clawed their way up from the earth, their eyes glowing with the same malevolent light as the others. Their hands, coated in dirt and blood, reached for him, mouths wide and eager for flesh. Harris fired again, the bullets lost in the tide of bodies. There was no more retreating. With one last glance at the safe house, now surrounded by the horde, Harris turned to face Langdon and the monsters, his mind cold with the realization of what had to be done. He pulled the pin from the grenade on his vest, gripping it tight as the creatures closed in. If this was the end, he'd take as many of those goddamn things with him as possible. Harris let out a breath, his thumb slipping off the safety lever. "For Ramirez," he whispered. The explosion ripped through the night, a blinding flash of light and fire consuming everything in its path. But in the distance, above the carnage, a single jack-o'-lantern still flickered, its carved grin unchanged, as if the town itself had been waiting for this moment all along. The infection had claimed its last victim. Or had it?